Good morning, South by Southwest. We have a speaker today. Space Rogue is his name. He's going to talk about threats to the electric grid. He is with Tenable Network Security. And over to you.
Thank you. Is mic working? Everybody can hear me okay? Good. All right, so my name is Cris Thomas, aka Space Rogue. Space Rogue's a name I use online quite a bit. Been using that handle for about 20 years now. I'm currently a strategist at Tenable Network Security. I also helped found the Loft Heavy Industries Hacker Think Tank, and I used to run the Hacker News Network. Today I want to talk to you about cyber war, which is a very complex and detailed topic, and I've got about 20 minutes to cover it. So we're going to gloss over a bit and focus on a few key points. So what is cyber war? According to Richard Clarke, who was the counterterrorism coordinator under Clinton and Bush, cyber war are actions by a nation state to penetrate computer systems for purposes of causing damage. Penetrate computer systems for purposes of causing damage. He said that in 2010 in his book Cyber War. So let's take a look at what that really means. Because the key definition here is to penetrate and cause damage, a lot of people point to previous examples of various incidents and say, oh look, here's an example of cyber war. This is something that happened that we need to be afraid of, that we need to prepare for. And sometimes they take on the Dick Cheney's 1% doctrine, where if there's a 1% chance of something happening, we need to exert 100% of our effort to prevent it. So one of the events that is pointed to a lot by people in the intelligence community, people who are talking about cyber war, are some blackouts that happened in Brazil back in 2005 and 2007. There was about 50 different blackouts. 60 Minutes covered this. They claimed they had six separate sources inside the intelligence community to confirm that these blackouts were caused by hackers. Even Richard Clarke, again, the coordinator of counterterrorism, said it was hackers. It was mentioned in a press conference by Obama that it was hackers. Unfortunately, it wasn't hackers. Brazil's electrical control systems aren't even connected to the internet. The internal regulatory agency for Brazil conducted an investigation into the power companies and where these blackouts were happening and found that the blackouts were caused by soot collecting on insulators and they weren't being properly maintained. They eventually fined the electric companies $3.2 million, or whatever the equivalent money is in Brazil, for their lack of maintenance. So that wasn't really a cyber war anything because it wasn't hackers. But another event that a lot of people point to as saying, oh look, cyber war, we need to be worried about this, happened in Illinois in 2011. There was a small water plant outside Chicago, water pump station outside Chicago, that had a water pump failure. And upon investigation, people were looking through computer logs, and there were IP addresses from Russia. Oh my God, there was hackers. They took out a water pump in Chicago. Why they would do this, I don't know why anybody didn't stop to think about it, but it was such a big story, it actually made it into an FBI Fusion Center report, and they blamed a cyber attack on this water pump failure. Well, water pumps happen to fail sometimes, and this particular water company had a third-party contractor who happened to be on vacation in Russia, who was VPNing back in, coincidentally at the same time that the water pump failed. So when they looked at the logs, they saw the IP addresses, they assumed it was hackers, but it wasn't. So no cyber war there either, right? So we're kind of seeing a pattern here develop. In 2014, Bloomberg wrote an article claiming that a Turkish pipeline explosion that happened in 2008 was the first instance ever of a cyber war attack. Bloomberg cited 4 unnamed sources, all close to the investigation that seemed to have inside knowledge. Well, again, we have this problem afterwards that we look at exactly what happened and what was going on in that region with the rebels and the separatists, and the valves that blew up on the pipeline, again, weren't even connected to the internet. And the company that owned the pipeline said, no, there was no hack attack. It was conventional explosives. The pipeline did blow up, but it had nothing to do with cyber war. So we have this pattern emerging of attacks or incidents, events being blamed on hackers or cyber attacks that aren't really cyber attacks. But the cyber war hawks will rattle their sabers and point to these events and say, look, we need to be prepared in case this happens in the United States. So an event that has recently made some news, you may have read about it, I think it was in the New York Times this morning actually. There's a small dam in Rye, New York, which is in that little sliver of New York that connects next to Connecticut. DHS investigated some incident. They got some evidence from somewhere, and they went to the dam and said something has happened here. We think it's Iran. Obama has actually come out and publicly blamed Iran for this attack, if you want to call it an attack. So the dam in question has no power generation capability. There's no power outage involved here. They have one small sluice gate for flood control that's supposedly electronically controlled, but it's never worked. So even if it was an attack, what are you going to do? Like the sluice gate doesn't even work. But I think today, after they publicly blamed Iran, the nation, a small group of hackers in Iran claimed responsibility and said that they weren't influenced by the government whatsoever. So even if this was an actual incident that happened over the internet from Iran, it appears that the nation of Iran was not involved. So there are dozens of other similar events that have happened over the years that people point to and say, oh my God, look, cyber war, we need to be prepared for this. There was a generator test, again, reported on 60 Minutes, the Aurora generator test, where they made a generator actually self-destruct through software code. But this was in a laboratory environment, very controlled situation, not real-world indicative whatsoever. There's a steel plant in Germany that a blast furnace was supposedly shut down incorrectly and caused millions of dollars worth of damage. This has been promoted by the German government as saying, oh, look, cyber war. But nobody knows what steel plant it was. Nobody's come forward and said, oh yeah, I worked at the steel plant and I was there when the blast furnace melted down. So we really have no corroboration on that event. Numerous satellite takeovers. Satellite takeover seems to happen about once every 5 years. But for some reason, again, we have no evidence to back up any of these claims of cyber war attacks. We do have two events where we can definitely point to penetrating computer systems and causing damage, the original definition of cyber war. One of them was caused by the United States. You may have heard about it, called Stuxnet, where we created special custom software to infiltrate Iran's, I get them confused a lot, infiltrate Iran's nuclear centrifuges and try to prevent or disrupt their nuclear bomb making capability. This was a massive effort by both the United States and Israel. First of all, it was two countries that were involved. The numerous teams worked on it over several months, and they used several zero-day or vulnerabilities that didn't have fixes in the code. It was also a very concerted effort to get the code into Iran. This wasn't just something simple like a guy in his basement one night says, oh, let me take out the centrifuges in Iran, types a few things, and boom, it's done. This was a very multi-million-dollar effort by the United States government and Israel. In other words, a lot of effort, right? The other event that we can now point to and say, yes, this was a cyber attack of some sort, happened last December in the Ukraine. There were 6 power companies that all lost power at the same time. This was a very well-coordinated attack, multi-pronged attack from various vectors. There was a DDoS attack on the phone systems at the same time. DDoS means a denial of service, means hundreds of people called the phones. And the reason they did that was because the only way the power company can tell if the power is out is if you call them. Well, a lot of places in the United States we have smart grid meters now, and they automatically tell the power company when the power goes out. Well, not all power companies have that, especially in the Ukraine. So the only way they know the power's out is if you call them and say, hey, my power's out. They plot your address on a map and say, okay, if this guy's out, then all the people around him are probably out because they're fed by this one substation. So if you disable the phone systems, it's going to prolong your power outage because the power company no longer knows where the outage is coming from. They used the attack also used some malware called Black Energy with something called a kill disk component to erase the hard drives to make it more difficult for them to recover. There was possible remote access. There's still a lot of conflicting information about this event, but there is enough information out now that we can point to and say, yes, somebody got together and figured out how to turn off the power at 6 different power plants. This is pretty scary. It's really one of the first instances that we have of this happening anywhere in the world, of an actual attack taking out the power. That can be scary. I mean, if you think about it, you don't want to lose the power here in the United States, right? The Ukraine attack only impacted 80,000 people, which sounds like a big number, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not. It's a very small number. The key thing about the Ukraine attack, I think you have to remember, is that the whole attack only lasted, or the whole outage, the power was only out for 3 hours. My power goes out for 3 hours every time in the winter when I get a storm. Like, it's not that big a deal. The other interesting bit on this particular event is that in order to turn the power back on, they had the linemen go out to each substation and switch them to manual control. That's why it took 3 hours, because they had to drive out to each one. So they just cut the computers out of the equation, switch to manual control, the power comes back up. So, can something like that happen in the US? Sure, possible, but there are 7,304 power plants of 1 megawatt or greater in the United States. 7,000. There are 3,748 different electric utilities in the United States. That's a lot of targets. That's a huge surface area that if you want to cause a major blackout, a Northeast style blackout, and keep the power down, that's a lot of effort on your part if you're going to attack that power grid. The fear isn't so much that there's a small isolated power outages. The fear is that there is going to be a widespread power outage. The entire Northeast US, the entire Southwest US, and that the power would stay out for long periods of time. So, again, the intelligence community and other people, the cyber war hawks as I like to call them, will point to previous blackouts that have happened in the United States that have caused widespread power outages. Sometimes they point to the blackouts of 1965 and 1977. I have to discount those two and some of the earlier ones because of Y2K. In the year 2000, a lot of power companies were very afraid of what would happen when the year 2000 kicked over and we didn't have the to-date problem, if you remember Y2K. And so a lot of power companies were upgraded their systems in the year 2000. So we have to look at events after the year 2000. The Northeast blackout of 2003. This was what's known as a classic cascading failure, where there was one small power outage in one place. That area drew power from surrounding areas to try to get power to their people, but it overloaded the next door neighbors and continued cascading, causing a widespread blackout. It affected most of New England, Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, and Ontario. Millions and millions of people. The initial cause is often blamed on a falling tree in Ohio. And again, people point to that. Well, if a tree can fall and cause that big of a blackout, imagine what a cyber attack could do. The problem is, if you actually look at the blackout itself and look at what the causes were, the tree was really just the straw on the camel's back. There was maintenance issues, there was policy issues, there was a whole series of events that led up to this blackout in 2003. But okay, fine, whatever. The power was only out for 24 hours in most cases, and it was restored very quickly. Again, power outages of 24 hours happen quite a bit on a small localized scale. So again, the cyber war hawks will, instead of 2003, they'll point to the Southwest blackout of 2011. Los Angeles, San Diego, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Mexico itself. This event, again, wasn't a result of one simple thing that happened causing the blackout. The after-action reports, the reports that came out afterwards cite 23 different events over 11 minutes. Like, you could not script this if you wanted to. If you're trying to create a blackout and you need to execute 23 different events in 11 minutes, that's going to be a little bit difficult to do. And again, the most of the power was restored in 11 hours. It wasn't a chaos-inducing event. It wasn't the end of the world as we know it. So, is the power grid at risk? Is there a potential for a cyber attack to happen? Yes, there is a small potential for this to happen. Yes, we need to devote resources to protect our power grid. But do we need to devote 100% of the effort for a 1% possibility of failure? I'm going to say we probably don't need to devote that much effort to it. As a counterpoint, let's talk about squirrels, or in electrical parlance, animal outages. In 2015, there's a website, you guys have stickers on your seats. There's a website called cybersquirrel1.com. And that website categorizes or lists and and confirms animal outages. And in 2015, they've confirmed 424 different outages caused by animals, which have resulted in 17 different fires. In 2014, there was 328 animal outages. And they count animal outages by squirrels, which is the most popular animal to cause an outage, snakes, birds, martins, all kinds of stuff. If you combined all the animal outages that are on this cybersquirrel1.com website and you tried to concentrate them into one area at the same time, you could take out all of the power in San Antonio and Austin for 46 days. So, again, there is a risk to the power grid. There is a small risk that cyber attacks will happen and cause a power outage. But we have a much greater risk, in my opinion, of squirrels. And so we may want to devote a little bit more effort to squirrels or something else rather than defending against cyber attacks. And so that's all I have today. If anybody has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer your questions.
So I hear you that there are many examples of mistaken cyber attacks on the grid, but do you think that in some way this could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, kind of giving people the idea to attack these companies, these types of companies?
Well, the idea is out there for a while. If you read on anything about cyber war at all, the power grid is the first thing that's mentioned. Financial markets are the second thing. And squirrels have actually taken out the NASDAQ in the past. I think for a whole day back in 2003 or something. Maybe it was 89, I don't remember. But those are the two big things that people talk about because they think, oh, power outage is going to result in chaos. People will die. And I actually have a stat. So the 2003 blackout in the Northeast resulted in 12 deaths, which is unfortunate, right? Squirrels have caused 5 deaths. So it's kind of equal in my mind. So any other questions? Yes? Rio de Janeiro when the entire traffic system went down. I am not familiar with that event.
It happened about 2004, 2006, somewhere in that area.
Was this was a blackout though that caused it?
It was a blackout.
Right,
yeah.
so at the beginning of the talk I talked about the Brazil blackouts which were originally labeled as hackers. Turns out to be soot on the insulators. It wasn't hackers. Yes. So there's a lot of cases of these mistaken cyber attacks that what I call the cyber war hawks will point to as evidence that they need to devote more resources to protecting the electric grid. Any other questions?
Regarding the Ukraine situation where
Yes.
they could just go to manual mode and cut the computers out, are we moving though to a more sophisticated grid where there's no way to cut the computers out and so that these attacks actually are harder to recover from?
I wish I could comment specifically. I'm not that familiar with how power companies are operating. I'm sure there are some companies that are going 100% automated with no manual. But I got to think that they're designing systems so that they can always go back to manual if they need to, because it's a secondary fail-safe, sort of like the old telephone grid. Like if the phone goes out, they have backups at the local stations and whatnot, the battery backup, so that's why you would have the power go out, but your phone would still work before we had cell phones, right? So power companies, I'm hoping, are doing the same thing. Any other questions? Yes.
When you start talking about the future of power grid and all that kind of stuff, a lot of people are thinking about Internet of Things and what things like smart meters and connected devices are going to do. Don't those sorts of technologies provide even more pathway for attack?
It does, yes. Internet of Things and whatnot, devices in your house, does increase your attack surface, is what we say in the information security industry. So if your attack surface is larger, your risk is a little bit greater. But your Internet of Things usually is just your refrigerator or your toaster or your oven or your thermostat. You know, if somebody breaks into those things, you know, they can turn your oven temperature up really high and maybe burn your house down. And that's terrible, right? That's very bad, but it's a localized one-person event. The cyber attack from a nation state isn't going to really care about one house, unless you're a target. You know, if you're the VP of the president, you know, whatever, then you're a target. But for most people, it's not really a risk. And the amount of effort that's required from a nation state to pull something like that off, there has to be a cost-benefit ratio, right? the Stuxnet attack cost the US millions of dollars. The benefit was that we delayed Iran's nuclear program, right? The Ukraine attack cost Russia probably quite a bit, lots of months of planning, but the trade-off for them was that they got the Crimea back as part of Russia, or are working on it anyway. That's the theory behind the current Ukraine attack anyway. Any other questions?
All right, thank you so much, Space.
Thanks.